100 years ago, if you asked who ruled in Europe, the answer was simple. They were names you could find in any history book: Bourbons, Habsburgs, Hohenzollerns, Romanovs, coronations, military parades, official portraits hanging in palaces. Power had a face, it had a uniform, and it wore a crown. Today, if you ask the same question, things get more complicated. Formally, those in charge are parliaments, presidents, European commissioners. You see their press conferences, their debates, their election campaigns. But if you look just a bit below the surface, another layer of power appears, almost always silent, almost always stable, almost always family-based. They are not called kings, but many of them have been influencing Europe for more generations than some political parties have existed. In this documentary, we are going to follow the trail of three surnames that rarely lead the evening news, but that run through the European economy like a network of cables under the asphalt: Wallenberg, Quandt, and Agnellis. Three families, three countries, three very different styles of power. In the north, a Swedish dynasty that has turned discretion into a form of rule: the Wallenbergs. They do not give interviews, they barely appear in public, but they have been embedded at the heart of Nordic industry for more than a century. Banks, telecommunications, engineering, military technology, their imprint is on sectors that support the day-to-day life of half the continent. In the center of Europe, the Quandts, a surname that, for many people, means nothing, but whose wealth is intimately tied to one of the symbols of modern German industry: BMW. A fortune that grew in the storm of the 20th century, between war contracts, reconstruction, and a historical memory that is hard to digest. And in the south, the Agnellis. If the Wallenbergs are the shadow and the Quandts are the metal, the Agnellis are the shop window. Glamour, football, cars, politics, magazine covers. A family that turned a factory in Turin into a national symbol and into a platform of power that goes far beyond engines. You may never have read a book about them, but it is very likely that today you have already touched something that depends on their decisions. A car, a bank card, a medicine, an internet connection, a football shirt, a plane ticket, a digital newspaper. That is the starting point of this story. Dynasties have not disappeared. They have simply changed stage. They no longer sit on golden thrones. They sit on boards of directors. They no longer rule territories. They rule flows of capital, information, and technology. If in the previous video we traveled through the lives of dynasties that were exporting princes and princesses across Europe, today we are going to look at those who export investments, executives, and corporate decisions. In the past, alliances were sealed with royal weddings, now with mergers and acquisitions. Before, the symbol was a coat of arms, today a logo on the front of a car or on the facade of a bank. But there is something that has not changed. Power tends to concentrate. And when it concentrates for generations in the same hands, even if those hands are private, we are facing a dynasty, even if no one bows to it in public. What then is a modern dynasty? A big company is not enough. Large companies can go bankrupt, merge, change hands. A modern dynasty is something more resilient than a particular brand. It is a combination of three elements: capital that is inherited, structures, foundations, holdings, banks that protect it, and a family culture that teaches each new generation that their real task is not to be rich, but to maintain and expand that web. In notarial archives, that translates into percentages of shares, shareholder agreements, wills. In everyday life, it translates into something else, into which companies survive crises, into who decides whether a factory closes or relocates, into which projects receive funding and which do not. While politics changes faces every 4 years, these families have spent more than a century watching governments, constitutions, currencies, even entire regimes go by. And there they remain, adapting, mutating, but without fully letting go of the rope. There is a detail that makes this story especially fascinating: the contrast between their impact and their visibility. If someone asks you who the president of your country is, you probably know. If they ask who the president of the European Commission is, you might as well. But if they ask who the Wallenbergs, the Quandts, or the Agnellis are, you might hesitate, even though part of your pension, your mortgage, or your job depends on companies in which they have a voice. That mismatch, Between what we see and what really holds up the structure is the heart of this journey. Over the next 2 hours, we are going to follow 3 parallel lines. We will see how the Wallenbergs turned a small family bank into a network of shareholdings that connects some of the most important companies in Northern Europe. We will review how the Quandt fortune was forged in the darkest periods of German history, and how that past still weighs on the present. And we will enter the saga of the Agnellis, a family that seems straight out of a novel: charismatic heirs, intimate tragedies, internal struggles for control of an industrial empire that stretches from car factories to VIP boxes in football stadiums. We are not going to talk only about numbers. We are going to talk about people, patriarchs who refuse to let go of the helm, heirs who do not fit the expected mold, decisions that save companies but break families, marriages that unite capital the way they once united territories. And every now and then, we will ask an uncomfortable question: to what extent do we accept the existence of these almost permanent centers of power, simply because they do not wear uniforms or step out onto balconies? Maybe, by the end of this documentary, you will still not be able to recognize their faces if you pass them on the street. But perhaps you will look differently at the logo of certain companies, at the names of certain banks, or at the surnames that quietly appear at the end of some annual reports. We will begin the first of these stories in just a moment. Before we get to know the Wallenbergs, the Quandts, and the Agnellis as families, we are going to understand what conditions made it possible for this kind of economic dynasty to be born in modern Europe, and why the ground was ready for a few family sagas without any need for crowns to become the new ruling houses of the continent. For centuries, the word dynasty made us think of crowns, palaces, and family trees full of coats of arms. Today, in theory, that is over. We live in republics, parliamentary monarchies, consolidated democracies. No one inherits by birth the right to sign laws. And yet, if we look calmly, we see something curious. Power does still get inherited. It has changed shape, it has changed stage, but it has not disappeared. What then is a modern dynasty when there are no more thrones? Having a lot of money is not enough. A famous footballer, an influencer, or a newly rich millionaire can amass an enormous fortune and lose it within a generation. That is not a dynasty. It is a spike on a graph. A modern dynasty needs 3 things. First, generational continuity. Capital and influence are not burned through in one lifetime. They are arranged so they can pass intact or even increased to children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. There is a before me and an after me, planned decades in advance. Second, control. It is not just about being a shareholder, but about having real capacity to influence strategic decisions. Choosing the chief executive, deciding whether to sell a division, close a factory, enter a new country. The surname is not on the front door of the company, but it is on the document that approves the 10-year plan. Third, a network of influence. The family does not live isolated, connected only to its company. It is intertwined with banks, funds, universities, parties, media outlets, foundations. It has a phone that rings when there's a crisis. It has access to information that the rest of us will only see weeks later in the newspapers. In this documentary, we are going to move between 3 layers of power that constantly overlap. The first is economic. Blocks of shares, investment banks, industrial conglomerates. Here, we will see holding companies, foundations with neutral-sounding names, structures that allow a family to dominate several firms without appearing directly as the owner of all of them. The second layer is political-institutional, the relationship these dynasties have with states, with Brussels, with central banks. They do not run for office, but they advise, influence, negotiate, sometimes from official commissions, sometimes from private lunches in hotels where there are no cameras. The third is cultural symbolic, the realm of brands, football, art, universities, a historic club, an art collection, a business school, a national newspaper, places where reputation, agenda, and narrative are manufactured. All of this may sound abstract, so let us bring it down to earth and follow someone, a figure who will serve as a thread throughout the documentary. Imagine an average European. It could be Lars, who starts work at a factory making industrial components on the outskirts of Stockholm, or Marta, who works in a bank branch in Milan. or Johann, who designs car parts in a German city, or a pensioner in Turin, living on a modest payment and getting around on public transport. They all have apparently normal lives. They get up early, go to work, pay taxes, watch supermarket prices, follow the news in passing. None of them considers themselves close to power. But if we followed the trail of their everyday lives, we would see the same nodes appear again and again. The bank where they receive their salary or keep their savings may be part of a group in which a family holds a stake that gives it privileged voting power in major decisions. The company that makes their car belongs to a conglomerate controlled by another dynasty. The medicine they take, the telecom company that gives them internet, the airline they fly with, even the football club they support as members. Many of those entities are connected to the surnames we are going to study. Lars does not know who the Wallenbergs are, but his job depends indirectly on a circle of decisions where that surname carries weight. Marta has never read an article about the Agnellis, but every weekend she sees the Juventus crest, symbol of a web of power that goes far beyond football. Johann might not be able to explain who Günther Quandt was, but he designs parts for cars made by a brand whose history cannot be understood without him. How is that kind of power built? In almost every case, the first brick is a family business, a regional bank, a machinery factory, a textile company, a car plant. At the beginning, the family is everywhere, in management, in day-to-day operations, in negotiations with suppliers. Over time, the business grows. It becomes necessary to professionalize management, hire external executives, list on the stock exchange, issue debt. And this is where long-term engineering comes in. The family starts putting distance between its surname and the operational front line, but it does not let go of the helm. Holding companies, investment vehicles, cross-shareholdings begin to appear. Foundations are created for the public good that, in addition to genuinely funding scholarships or social projects, concentrate the shares with voting rights. Stakes are divided up among family branches, but rules are agreed so that no one can easily sell their part and unravel the whole. Marriages remain important, but they no longer fill palace ballrooms. They are announced in the society pages and consolidated in the business pages. A wedding can unite two blocks of shares, bring two banks closer together, create a joint voting bloc. A badly handled divorce can put at risk a delicate structure designed 40 years ago. And above all, modern dynasties have learned something the old ones often forgot: the value of being discreet. The more noise the brand makes, the less noise the surname should make. All this raises an uncomfortable question that is going to accompany us through the coming parts. In societies that see themselves as democratic, what do we do with forms of power that do not go through the ballot box, that are inherited, and that can be maintained for a century? There is no simple answer. These families have also financed innovation, jobs, research, culture. They have kept companies alive that perhaps, without a long-term vision, would have disappeared in a crisis. But at the same time, they concentrate decisions that affect millions of people, without those people having almost any real capacity to control who is making them. Throughout the documentary, we will come back now and then to that average European, to Lars, to Marta, to Johann, to the pensioner in Turin. We will ask what it means for them to live under a system where the visible faces change every electoral cycle, while certain surnames remain. And if all of this still feels distant, too theoretical, it is worth starting somewhere concrete. A country that usually appears in rankings of transparency, equality, and well-being. A place many people see as an example of how a social market economy should work. There, in the heart of Sweden, there is a surname that quietly repeats itself when we look at the economic history of the last century: Wallenberg. You will not see their name on football shirts, nor in emotional advertising campaigns. But if you open the shareholder lists of some of the largest Nordic banks, tech firms, industrial giants, the trail of that family appears again and again. Our journey begins there, in a country that seems to have everything under control, and with a family saga that has turned silent control into its specialty. If you close your eyes and think of Sweden, the face of a banker probably does not come to mind. You see snow, forests, minimalist design, perhaps a Volvo, an IKEA, a welfare state that seems to work, a country where power is spread out, where institutions are strong and corruption, according to all the headlines, is low. But if instead of closing your eyes you open an economic report from the last 100 years, one surname appears again and again, like a sort of silent thread, stitching together banking, industry, technology, and economic policy: Wallenberg. For much of modern Swedish history, if you lifted the carpet on any major industrial deal, you almost always found, directly or indirectly, the shadow of a Wallenberg seated at some table, looking over numbers, making calls, authorizing or blocking decisions. The story begins in the 19th century, when a Lutheran pastor called Wallenberg has a son, Andre Oskar, who decides to tweak the family trajectory slightly. Instead of the pulpit, he chooses the world of finance. He founds a bank, still modest, geared toward trade and credit. In that Sweden just beginning to industrialize, credit was oxygen, and whoever controls oxygen in an industrial system will very soon control much more than that. That bank over the years grows, merges, adapts. It becomes one of the pillars of the Swedish financial system. But what matters is not just the bank itself, but the philosophy with which the family begins to operate. It is not about being one more intermediary, but about becoming the silent partner of the companies that are going to build the country. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as Sweden moves from being a relatively poor country to an industrial power, the Wallenbergs are in the right place with the right mindset. While other banks lend and wait, they lend and ask for something more in return: influence, shareholdings, seats on boards of directors. This is how the figure of the Wallenberg industrial banker is born. Someone who not only looks at balance sheets, but gives opinions on strategy, looks for executives, pushes mergers, stops overly risky ventures. Companies in key sectors, energy, telecoms, machinery, transport, find in that network of capital and boards a kind of financial backbone. For the Swedish viewer of the time, all of this is almost invisible. What they see are growing companies, opening factories, railways linking cities. For our imaginary Lars, the young Swede who starts work at an industrial plant in the 1960s, Wallenberg is, at most, a surname that appears in passing in the business pages. His contract is signed by Company A, not by the family that, through several levels of shareholdings, shapes that company's future. The big structural leap comes when the family realizes that if it wants to keep ruling without appearing on the front line, it needs to separate roles even further. That is where two pillars arise that will support Wallenberg power throughout the 20th century and well into the 21st, the foundations and the holding company. On one hand, the Wallenberg foundations. Legally, philanthropic entities that fund research, scholarships, scientific projects, culture. And they genuinely do so. There are laboratories, universities, and high-level projects that would not exist without that money. But at the same time, these foundations concentrate stakes in strategic companies. They are portfolios of shares with voting rights that do not depend on the whims of a particular heir, but on a structure designed to endure. On the other hand, the holding company, an investment firm that groups those industrial and financial stakes and acts as a coordinating brain. From there, decisions are made about which company is reinforced, which is sold, which sectors to enter, which to exit. Through this mechanism, the Wallenbergs can control or influence firms that, on paper, are highly diversified and professionally managed. At the center of this web, there is no king or queen, but a chain of figures who share a similar profile. Men, for a long time they were almost exclusively men, with sober manners, dark suits, international education, and obsession with discretion. An archetypal Wallenberg does not seek front pages, he seeks stability. He does not give fiery speeches, he speaks in short, carefully measured sentences at press conferences where he never says more than necessary. Within the family, this translates into a very specific culture. Being born a Wallenberg is not so much a golden ticket to a life of ostentatious luxury as a kind of gentle sentence to a life of discipline. From a very young age, heirs who show promise for leadership roles go through elite boarding schools, demanding universities, internships in banks and group companies. They learn languages, they become familiar with balance sheets before they do with gossip magazines. In the testimonies that have emerged over the years, a pattern appears. The idea of duty. duty toward the family, but also toward something that is spoken of as the country. For the Wallenbergs and for many people around them, their role is almost that of a parallel civil service, sustaining through capital the stability of the Swedish model. Of course, this has another side. That obligation means giving up a freer life, accepting that your surname comes with a script that is largely written in advance. It means marrying within certain circles, guarding your reputation to almost obsessive extremes, avoiding personal scandals that could splash onto the whole. And, above all, it means making decisions that affect thousands of Lars, Martas, or Johans spread across factories, offices, and labs. Shutting down a plant in a remote town, pushing a relocation, betting on one sector and abandoning another. These are decisions an anonymous shareholder can make without feeling much personal responsibility. For a member of a dynasty whose name is on the front of the bank, even if only metaphorically, the burden is different. Up to this point, the story might sound almost sterile. A Protestant, hard-working, discreet family using its economic power to industrialize a country and fund science and culture. A sort of technocratic version of the old dynasties, but without crowns and without palaces open to the public. However, the true weight of a surname is not measured only in times of growth and stability, but in the moments when everything around it collapses. And in the case of the Wallenbergs, that moment has a proper name that suddenly shatters the chilly image of the calculating banker. Raoul. Raoul Wallenberg was not the typical manager sitting on a board. He was a diplomat, a family member who, during the Second World War, ended up in the most dangerous place in Europe for a man with his passport, Nazi-occupied Budapest. His story of protective passports, rented buildings turned into refuges, desperate negotiations with Nazi officers to save lives, would not only mark the family, but also add a moral and tragic dimension to the surname. Suddenly, the name Wallenberg was no longer linked solely to balance sheets and dividends, but also to life and death decisions. To understand what that means, we have to leave the tidy offices of Stockholm and descend into the chaotic, threatened streets of a besieged city. There, we will see to what extent the weight of a dynasty can, for a moment, turn into something radically different from a block of shares. Raoul Wallenberg was born into a world carefully cushioned by privilege. Elegant school, foreign languages from childhood, international contacts before he was even old enough to vote. At family gatherings, the older generation talked about banks, companies, and European politics the way other people talk about the weather. The surname opened doors in embassies, on boards, in ministries, but his path soon veered away from the traditional route of the office banker. Raoul studied architecture in the United States, worked in commercial ventures, moved easily between cultures and borders. He was the kind of family member who serves as a bridge, sufficiently of the family to understand power, and sufficiently restless not to remain sitting in a comfortable armchair for the rest of his life. When the Second World War began to devour Europe, Sweden officially remained neutral. From the outside, the country looked like a relatively quiet island in the midst of chaos. But for someone like Raoul, who read reports, who spoke with refugees, who traveled, it was obvious that this neutrality carried an enormous moral cost. In 1944, the focus of horror concentrated on Hungary. Tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews were being deported at a terrifying speed. Jewish organizations and diplomats were desperately looking for someone with the right profile for a mission that was poorly defined but extremely dangerous: to go to Budapest under German occupation with Swedish credentials and try to save as many people as possible. That is where Raoul Wallenberg appears. It is important to understand what this meant within a family like his. He was not an anonymous volunteer. He was a Wallenberg with a diplomatic passport, a man who, on paper, could have spent the war in safe offices, attending embassy dinners, writing polished reports. He chose something else. When he arrived in Budapest, the city was a macabre chessboard. German troops, collaborationist Hungarian authorities, Gestapo offices, rumors of a Soviet advance. And in between, a terrified Jewish population, marked, cornered, waiting for trains whose destination everyone pretended not to fully know. The tool Raoul would turn into a weapon looked very much like a simple sheet of paper: Swedish protective passports and certificates, documents stating that the bearer was under the protection of the Swedish state and, in theory, could not be deported. They were not legal miracles. They were fragile bureaucratic shields in the hands of a man willing to stretch his credibility to the limit. The scenes reconstructed from testimonies have something surreal about them. Raoul appears at stations, in building courtyards, in prisoner columns. He carries folders filled with papers bearing the Swedish coat of arms. He shouts, argues, demands. He points at people at random within a group and proclaims that they are Swedish citizens or protégés, even though in many cases he has never seen them before. Sometimes German officers give way, tired of trouble. At other times, they agree to swap lives for bribes, pressure from the Swedish legation, veiled threats about complicating diplomatic relations. Raoul plays a dangerous game in which he mixes the authority granted by his passport with a huge dose of theater and personal daring. At the same time, he rents buildings and declares them protected houses. In those buildings, entire families try to live in impossible normality. Children playing in corridors while their parents sleep in their clothes in case someone breaks down the door in the middle of the night. Every door bears a plaque with the Swedish coat of arms. Every plaque is a small act of defiance. All this is done by a young man born into comfort who could have looked the other way. It is easy to imagine, even if the documents do not tell us, tense conversations by letter with Stockholm, relatives wondering whether he is going too far, whether he is exposing himself more than is reasonable. And at the same time, a certain silent pride at seeing a Wallenberg embodying the noblest part of the responsibility they always claimed to have. In January 1945, when Soviet troops entered Budapest, the script looked set for a heroic ending. The Swedish savior who survives, returns, tells what happened, becomes a symbol. But the story takes another turn. Raoul Wallenberg is arrested by the Soviet authorities. From that moment on, his life becomes a jigsaw of contradictory reports, rumors, vague statements. A prison camp mentioned here, a possible sighting there, an official note years later saying he died in prison of unknown causes. For the family, for the Swedish state, for all those he saved, Raoul becomes something strange. A hero without a body, a disappeared man whom no one can bury or fully mourn. The capacities for influence that the Wallenbergs have accumulated over generations, contacts, money, prestige, suddenly show their limits. Neither the surname, nor the banks, nor the boards are enough to pull a man out of the bowels of a system like the Soviet one. That contrast profoundly marks the meaning of the surname. While in Sweden, the Wallenberg Foundations continue awarding scholarships, funding universities, taking part in key industrial decisions, in the family and national memory, the shadow of a relative who risked everything and vanished into a bureaucratic black hole. No one wants to talk too loudly about remains engraved. Raoul gradually becomes an international symbol of individual courage in the face of genocidal machinery. But within the logic of modern dynasties, he is also something else, an uncomfortable reminder that the power they wield has clear limits, and that the human cost of those biographies is not measured only in dividends, but sometimes in disappearances that are never fully explained. For our average European, that worker or pensioner we mentioned, Raoul is, at most, a street name, a plaque on a wall, a mention in a documentary. For the Wallenbergs, he is a mirror that probably weighs more than any annual balance sheet. And yet, the economic machinery did not stop. After the war, Sweden consolidated itself as a social democratic model, industry modernized, companies in the Wallenberg orbit went global. While the mystery of Raoul remained trapped in classified files and investigative commissions, the surname went on whispering decisions in increasingly global boardrooms. From the second half of the 20th century on, the family's role evolved. From national bankers to architects of multinational conglomerates, telecom firms, engineering companies, pharmaceutical groups, high-tech businesses, all of them, to a greater or lesser extent, passed through their orbit. What began as a bank funding railways in a small country slowly turns into a web of influence that reaches Silicon Valley, China, Brussels. And the hallmark remains the same: discretion, stability, continuity. While some old blood dynasties struggle to keep their palaces open to tourists, the Wallenbergs have understood that their throne is no longer made of marble and velvet, but of shareholdings, percentages, and seats on governing boards. And from that invisible throne, they look out over a continent where they are not the only ones who have learned the lesson. Because if in Northern Europe power dresses itself in Protestant sobriety, further south we will find a very different tradition, that of families who mix money, glamour, car factories, and VIP boxes in football stadiums. And that is where the Agnellis come onto the stage. In the post-war years, while Europe as a whole tried to reassemble its institutions, the Wallenbergs did something few families managed. They turned a clearly family-based power into something that, over time, would come to be perceived almost as a natural part of the Swedish state. They were not the government, they were not a ministry, they were not a royal house. But for many citizens, the Wallenbergs began to sound as inevitable as taxes or winter. The model they built was not based on a single family bank where everything was decided around one long table. It was more sophisticated: holdings, foundations, cross-shareholdings. Instead of having their name on every facade, what they did was place their hand on the centers of gravity of the Swedish economy. On one side, the family foundations, not only as philanthropic instruments, but also as vehicles of control. Through them, the surname kept stable stakes in banks, industrial firms, tech, and pharmaceutical companies. Those foundations awarded scholarships, funded research, supported universities. To the public, they were engines of progress. Behind closed doors, they were also anchors to keep power from scattering. On the other side, the big industrial financial holding, a company that does not itself manufacture anything, but that decides which factories live, which merge, which firms deserve a quiet rescue, and which should learn the market's lesson. When a strategic sector wobbled, it was not unusual for the Wallenberg surname to appear in negotiations, even if it never turned up in a headline. Let us go back to our average European. In this case, imagine a 40-year-old woman in the suburbs of Stockholm. She has a mortgage with a traditional bank. She has spent years working at an engineering company that exports to half the world. Her children were born in a public hospital where their treatment depended on drugs developed by large Nordic firms. She pays with a card. She invests a small saving in a pension fund. In her day-to-day life, she does not say the word Wallenberg even once. But if we followed the trail of every transaction, every salary payment, every investment, we would see again and again entities in whose structure, sooner or later, the surname appears. That is the heart of the Wallenberg system, a network so embedded in the economy that it is hard to tell where the family's private interest ends and where the country's interest begins. For decades, the dominant narrative has been kind. The Wallenbergs as responsible guardians of Swedish capitalism, a sort of technocratic aristocracy that thinks long-term, does not speculate, protects industrial capacity when others would flee at the first sign of crisis. It is not an empty myth. More than once, when big strategic companies have been in trouble, it has been the patience of those old surname shareholders that has made it possible to avoid a hasty sale to foreign capital or a pure and simple liquidation. For many Swedes of a certain age, the idea that the Wallenbergs are behind major economic decisions gives a strange sense of security. I may not agree with everything they do, but at least they are not fly-by-night opportunists. They think in decades. But that very stability has a troubling flip side. Every so often, in parliamentary debates, in newspaper articles, in coffee break conversations, the same question resurfaces. Is it healthy for a single family to have so much capacity to influence key sectors for so long with so little real public exposure? Defenders answer that the system works, that Sweden combines growth and welfare, that companies are competitive and institutions solid. Critics talk about concentration of power, about elite networks that have known each other since childhood, about a capitalism in which certain surnames always seem to be in the second row, but never leave the stage completely. In that debate, the Wallenbergs move with a calculated mix of modesty and firmness. They do not seek cameras, they avoid grand emotional speeches, they express themselves in the sober language of annual reports and economic conferences. They often insist that they do not own Sweden, but merely assume a historical responsibility in specific sectors. The implicit message is clear. We could have sold long ago. We did not. We are still here, holding up the system. For the viewer, what is unsettling is that this no longer looks anything like a royal court with uniforms and balconies, but it does look very much like a new form of dynasty. The external symbols change: crowns for logos, palaces for glass and steel headquarters, genealogies for organizational charts. But one element we already know from the past remains: the idea that certain families are so woven into a country's architecture that it is hard to imagine the system without them. And yet, there is a fundamental difference with the dynasties of old. The Wallenbergs have learned to legitimize themselves not by divine right, nor even by tradition, but by results. Scholarships, scientific prizes, jobs, investments in innovation. Every year, the foundations and holdings publish figures that serve as a silent answer to criticism. This is what we contribute. This is what we fund. This is how we give back part of what we have. The average Swedish worker might not know who sits on the board of a given holding, but they do know that their company survived a crisis, that their town still has an important factory, that their university launched a cutting-edge research center. And even if no one phrases it this way, the underlying message that seeps through is, better a stable shareholder, even if it is a powerful family, than an anonymous fund that next year will be investing somewhere else in the world. What is fascinating and at the same time unsettling is that this model has not been widely exported. It is very Swedish in its sobriety, its emphasis on consensus and stability. In other European countries, modern dynasties have followed different paths, colliding with national histories that are much more turbulent and with pasts that do not fit so easily into the official narrative. While in Sweden, the Wallenberg surname appears in history books almost as if it were just another institution, in Central Europe, there are business families that have had to deal with another kind of legacy, that of having multiplied their wealth in times when the political regime was built on violence and exclusion. If in the North we talk about responsible guardians, in Germany the debate often revolves around a much more uncomfortable word: complicity. And that is where our journey changes tone. Because when we head down toward the industrial heart of Europe and start following the trail of certain family fortunes, we find a story in which factories, concentration camps, and dividends appear, awkwardly, in the same sentence. The story of a surname that many people today associate with luxury cars, but whose path before 1945 is anything but elegant: the Quandts. Let us imagine Germany just after the First World War. A humiliated country, factories at a standstill, breadlines, an empire that has just vanished. Amid that landscape of ruins appears a kind of figure who will be crucial in the 20th century: the industrialist who knows how to see opportunities where others see only rubble. One of those men is called Günther Quandt. He is not an aristocrat with a medieval pedigree. He is the embodiment of the new German power, an entrepreneur calculating, obsessed with growth. He starts in textiles, moves into batteries, machinery, takes stakes in various firms, always with the same idea in mind: diversify, expand, control. While many people lose everything in the inflation of the 1920s, he manages, through shrewd purchases and the right contacts, to emerge ever more reinforced. Where others see the end of an era, he sees the beginning of a family industrial empire. In his private life, those merger operations also exist, but in the form of marriage. Among them, one union will have unexpected historical consequences: his marriage to a young woman named Magda. For Günther, it is another marriage in a life marked by calculation and bourgeois respectability. For her, it will be the first step on a path that will take her into the very heart of the continent's most destructive regime. From that marriage, a son is born, Harold, who will later be adopted by the man Magda marries next, Joseph Goebbels, Adolf Hitler's future propaganda minister. It is a disturbing junction. On one side, the businessman who is building a fortune out of factories and contracts. On the other, the fanatical politician who will turn lies into a weapon of the state. At the intersection sits a family, a child, a private sphere that seems small compared to history. But that reminds us that behind every surname, there are dinners, arguments, intimate decisions that intertwine with power. The rise of Hitler to power in 1933 changed the rules of the game for all German industry, and the Quandts were no exception. Suddenly, the state was rearming. Uniforms, batteries, rifles, ammunition, vehicles were needed. It was the dream of any industrialist who knew how to move in the right circles. Gunther Quandt was already well positioned. His companies produced exactly what the new regime demanded. Contracts multiplied, revenues shot up, the machinery never stopped. But that expansion had a price. As the war went on, voluntary labor was no longer enough. The war economy fed on forced labor, prisoners of war, deportees, people dragged from their homes all over Europe, on the grounds of factories linked to the Quandt universe, as happened with so many other companies in the Reich. Barracks, barbed wire, guards appeared. People who had not chosen to be there assembled parts, loaded materials, repeated the same gestures over and over under watch, hungry, afraid. The contrast is brutal if we look at the scene from above. In one office, a board of directors discusses production, costs, deliveries to the army, new investments. Somewhere else, separated by many kilometers but connected by contracts, thousands of anonymous hands generate the wealth that allows those balance sheets to grow. Some of those workers would not survive the war. Their names would not appear in family genealogies or in business history books. And yet, without them, the family fortune would look very different today. It is important to underline this. The Quandts were not the only ones. A large part of German industry benefited from the system of slave labor implemented by the Nazi regime. But in this particular story, we are interested in seeing how a modern dynasty is built in part on that combination of economic opportunity and criminal political context. It is not just a bad period on a financial chart. It is decisions, contracts signed, factories expanded in full knowledge of who worked in them and under what conditions. When the war ended in 1945 and the Third Reich collapsed, the basis of power of many industrialists also seemed to collapse. The country lay in ruins. The Allies opened investigations. Responsibilities were reviewed. Gunther Quandt was arrested and interrogated. His role during the regime, his ties, his profits were examined. The outcome of the denazification processes labeled him a beneficiary of the system, someone who took advantage of the regime but who would not be condemned as one of the great war criminals. From the outside, for many survivors and observers, that classification sounded strange. The system that had enabled the mass exploitation of forced workers seemed to dissolve into bureaucratic nuances. For the family, by contrast, it meant something very concrete, the possibility of keeping a large part of its assets, reorganizing its companies, and continuing to operate in the new Germany that was about to be born. Here, a detail appears that defines very well the logic of modern dynasties. Where a monarchy would have lost its throne after a war, an industrial family can reconfigure itself, change brand, adapt its narrative, and carry on. The factories that yesterday produced for the army would now produce for reconstruction. The same surname that had been present in the darkest years would slowly become a symbol of the so-called post-war economic miracle. In that transition, there are silences, archives that are scarcely consulted, stories from former workers that take decades to be heard. For a long time, the dominant narrative in West Germany focused on modernization, growth, the new cars on the motorways. Only much later would researchers and journalists begin to piece together, with names and documents, what exactly lay behind some family fortunes. Meanwhile, the Quandts were preparing for the next phase. If Gunther represented the first major builder of the fortune in the context of the Third Reich, the next generation would have to show that this wealth could also serve a different purpose. Building competitive companies in a democratic country, exporting technology, creating jobs. It was an economic challenge, but also a moral one, although it was rarely phrased openly in those terms. And it is precisely at that crossroads that the heir appears, who would change the family's destiny and that of a brand we all recognize today. In the years when Germany was trying to turn the page and build a new identity, a Quandt decided to bet heavily on a struggling car maker. And here, a brutal irony appears. While Germany was trying to erase every trace of the regime, an heir to this fortune would end up becoming the savior of one of the country's most beloved brands. That heir was called Herbert Quandt, and his bet on a company on the brink of bankruptcy would change not only his family's history, but also the history of the European automobile. By the late 1950s, West Germany was shedding its old skin. The ruins were beginning to disappear from the streets, the motorways were filling up again. The term Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle, was making its way into the newspapers. But on one very specific corner of that new Germany, there was a symbol crumbling: BMW. The brand of the propeller, born from aviation and reconverted to cars and motorbikes, had been dragging along years of bad decisions, poorly profitable models, a muddled range, dubious investments. By 1959, the scene was almost caricature-like. A company with a past, with talented engineers, but with red ink in the books and a question hanging over every internal meeting. How much time do we have left? In the workshops, rumors traveled faster than the assembly lines themselves. There was talk of a sale, of a takeover, of Daimler-Benz as a possible buyer. For many workers, that meant something very simple: mergers, layoffs, relocations. At that moment, Herbert Quandt came onto the scene. He was no unknown in German business circles. He was an heir to shares, to companies, to contacts. Also, whether he liked it or not, an heir to a shadow stretching from the years of the Reich into those post-war days. What he had before him was not just a financial opportunity. It was the chance to write a different chapter for his surname. BMW's situation did not exactly invite optimism. On paper, the most reasonable option seemed clear: accept the purchase offer, integrate BMW into a bigger group, save what could be saved, and assume that the brand, as it had been known until then, would disappear. Many shareholders leaned towards that way out, better an orderly end than a prolonged agony. The figures seemed to be on their side. And yet, in that atmosphere of resignation, Herbert began to do something that felt almost anachronistic. He became obsessed with the idea that BMW could survive. He reviewed balance sheets, listened to executives, talked to engineers, weighing not only the current value, but also what the brand might become in a motorized, growing Germany eager to consume more than just basic goods. Perhaps, he thought, the company was badly managed, not doomed. In one of those crucial meetings when the takeover seemed almost a done deal, Herbert decided to change course. Instead of supporting the sale, he announced that he would buy more shares, that he would assume an active role in restructuring, that he would stake his own capital on BMW's survival. It was not just a financial maneuver, it was a public statement. This brand has a future. Not everyone believed him. Some probably saw it as a reckless gesture or one driven by pride. The bet did not remain just words. It came with a plan. To reorganize the range, abandon the experiments that did not make money, focus on models that could become objects of desire for a new middle class, cars that were not just means of transport, but symbols of status and professional success. BMW stopped trying to be everything to everyone and began to look for a very specific niche: the car of the well-off professional, the doctor, the lawyer, the manager who wanted something more than a runabout. The following years were the dress rehearsal for that new role. Little by little, the models hit the mark more often. The brand image was refined, the design became recognizable, the famous front end began to turn into something anyone could identify in their rearview mirror. Dealerships stopped being nervous spaces waiting for the next bankruptcy rumor and turned into showcases of aspiration. One day, I'll have a BMW. Here, we can return to our recurring character, the average European. This time, imagine an ordinary German in the 1970s or 1980s. He has worked hard, business is going well, the children are growing up, the country seems stable. At some point, he walks into a dealership, sits for the first time behind the wheel of a shiny saloon, smells the new interior, feels the engine respond. He does not sign a contract thinking about industrial dynasties, post-war histories, munitions factories. He signs because that car promises him something: comfort, recognition, a certain sense of having made it. The scene would be repeated thousands of times in different versions: an Italian entrepreneur, a French engineer, a Spanish executive. All of them engage with the brand. Very few ask themselves who controls the shareholding that makes that experience possible. Herbert Quandt, meanwhile, watched how his apparently risky bet turned into a textbook success story. BMW went from being on the verge of disappearance to embodying, for many, the best of German engineering and design. In strictly economic terms, the move was brilliant. BMW's recovery multiplied the value of the family's stake, consolidated the Quandts' position in the business elite, and fixed a simple, almost perfect narrative for the decades that followed. A visionary who saw where others only saw ruins dared to take a risk and saved a brand. It is the friendly face of post-war capitalism, the one that fits nicely in reports about the economic miracle and in inspirational biographies. But beneath that bright narrative, there runs another, more tense line that never completely disappears. Herbert had built a different kind of business legacy from his father's, yes, but he had done so on a capital base that came in part from that dark past. It is a tension that was rarely spoken aloud in the 1960s or 1970s. Germany was busy rebuilding, integrating into Europe, looking forwards. Many uncomfortable stories were put away in drawers, literally and figuratively. We can speculate about something the documents do not fully explain, but that is impossible not to imagine. To what extent was Herbert aware of that inner contradiction? To what extent was the need to prove that the family fortune could be associated with innovation, jobs, and international prestige, also a way of fleeing from the shadow of the war factories? We do not know. What we do know is that, for a long time, the official story would stick to the bright side of the tale. Outside those offices, the BMW buyer simply went on with his life. He took his children to school, overtook trucks on motorways, showed off his car on Sundays. In advertising campaigns, we saw the car, the landscape, sometimes the idealized driver. What we never saw was the surname of those who controlled the shares, the votes at shareholders' meetings, the big decisions about investment, expansion, and staff cuts. Family power dissolved into logos, slogans, and quarterly figures. For decades, the official story was straightforward. A visionary businessman saved a brand, and everyone won. But at some point, someone began to ask uncomfortable questions. Questions about the origin of the fortune, about the names of factories during the war, about who worked there and under what conditions. Researchers, journalists, descendants of victims began to put pieces together. And those questions eventually crystallized into something no modern dynasty wants. A documentary, in prime time, shining a spotlight on what had been kept in the shadows. That twist would mark the next stage of our story. Because the Quandts saga is not just the chronicle of a brilliant corporate rescue, it is also the tale of how, in contemporary Europe, the ghosts of the past can come knocking again, precisely when a family believes it has earned the right to be remembered only for its successes. And to understand how far public opinion can alter the carefully built balance of a modern dynasty, we have to go into that editing room, into that script the Quandts would never have wanted to see broadcast in prime time. For a long time in Germany, there was a kind of tacit agreement. Rebuild first, ask questions later. Factories were producing again, cities were rising from the rubble, families were trying to rebuild broken lives. In that context, the industrial past of the Third Reich was treated like an uncomfortable archive best not opened too far. Companies changed logos, advertising, campaigns. What barely changed was the basic structure of who was in charge and who benefited. Within that silence, many fortunes grew and consolidated. Among them, that of the Quandts. BMW was already a symbol of success. Cars were selling worldwide. Magazines spoke of the German miracle and the pride of national engineering. Adverts showed happy families, perfect roads, powerful engines. Not one word about endless shifts in munitions factories, forced labor, barracks guarded by soldiers. But silence is never eternal. There comes a moment when someone asks a seemingly simple question: who was making all that during the war? From there, the thread starts to unravel. Young historians digging into dusty archives, journalists going through old company documents, activists looking for the names of missing relatives. And little by little, the links appear. Companies that still exist, well-known surnames, places that are now industrial estates and once were enclosures surrounded by barbed wire. In the Quandt case, that process took especially visible form when a team of documentary makers decided to gather all those pieces into a single story. The material was there: testimonies from former workers, letters, production orders, military reports, people talking about factories where work was carried out under coercion, about prisoners of war assigned as cheap labor, about conditions that, at best, bordered on inhuman. Imagine one of those scenes, an elderly man in front of the camera, trembling hands, telling how he arrived as a prisoner at a plant controlled by companies linked to the family. He talks about shifts, hunger, comrades falling ill, guards who would not tolerate the slightest complaint. Intercut with that, glossy images of today's cars, glass corporate headquarters, illuminated logos at night. The contrast needs no underlining. It explains itself. For descendants of victims, for former workers, or for those who grew up hearing whispered stories in the kitchen, watching that documentary on television is a mix of relief and pain. At last, someone puts names and surnames to what they had lived through, and at the same time there is a feeling that it has taken far too long. Decades in which the brand paraded around the world as a symbol of prosperity while they carried memories almost no one wanted to hear. And the family? For years, their main strategy had been discretion. Do not talk much about the past, do not argue in public, trust that the passage of time would dilute questions. But when cameras go in, when audience figures are high and newspapers echo the story, that option becomes untenable. The Quandts are forced to react. The response arrives in the form of statements, and above all, something very characteristic of our time: historical studies commissioned by the family itself. Independent researchers are hired, given access to internal archives, promised that their conclusions will be published in full without airbrushing. It is at once an attempt to assume responsibility and to control the narrative. Better to bring the skeletons out of the closet yourself than wait for others to do it their way. The reports that emerge from these commissions are usually sober, full of tables, names, dates, business decisions. But read carefully, they leave little room for doubt. Yes, there was participation in the Reich's economic system. Yes, there were direct profits from the war. Yes, there were factories where prisoners and forced laborers worked. In their statements, the family speaks of regret, of historical responsibility, announces donations, scholarships, memorial projects. This is where the story leaves the purely factual realm and enters an uncomfortable zone for the viewer as well. Because the question is no longer just what the Quandts did between 1933 and 1945, but what we do today with that knowledge. When a current customer gets into a car from the brand, is they legitimizing that past? Is it fair to demand that they carry that awareness, or is responsibility limited to the family and the company in how they remember, compensate, and educate? We could return to our average European, this time in front of the television, watching the documentary. He has a BMW parked in the street. He bought it in installments, with effort, proud to have managed it. Suddenly, he sees images of barracks, death tolls, invoices issued to companies bearing the Quandt surname. He is not going to return the car the next day, but perhaps he will never look at it quite the same way again. Between the price, the horsepower, and the fuel consumption, a fourth variable has slipped in: the origin of that whole structure. And that leads us to a question with no easy answer. Can we completely separate a company's current success from the origin of the fortune that saved it? Some will say yes, that the people working in those factories today, the engineers who design, the mechanics who fix cars, are not to blame for what their corporate ancestors did. Others will insist that without a clear and visible confrontation with the past, wealth rests on an injustice that has never really been repaired. In between, modern dynasties try to find a balance. Unlike the Wallenbergs, the Quandts cannot fit their story into a comfortable, responsible guardians of capitalism narrative, and leave it at that. Their moral legitimacy is crossed by an intense shadow that resurfaces whenever people talk about historical memory, reparations, unfinished justice. That crack does not destroy their economic power, but it does condition how they can present themselves in public, what kind of visibility they can afford, and how far they can exploit their own surname as a brand. Meanwhile, in other corners of Europe, another family is writing a different story. Less bound to weapons factories, more intertwined with politics, economic crises, the terrorism of the 1970s, and surprisingly, with something apparently as light as football. A family whose surname appears on motorways, newspapers, elite clubs, and above all, on the front of cars driving all over the continent. Because while Germany was trying to reconcile its industrial past with the horror of Nazism, another kind of modern dynasty was taking shape in Italy, more visible, more glamorized, more wrapped in national mythology. To find it, we have to go to Turin. There, one surname dominates factories, headlines, and even stadiums, a surname you may already recognize, even if you do not quite know how far it extends: Agnelli. If in Sweden, power hides behind foundations, and in Germany it camouflages itself among balance sheets inherited from the post-war years, in Italy, power has a name, a face, cars, a football club, and even a certain movie-like aura. Agnelli. To understand them, we first have to do something important. Stop thinking of Fiat as just a car brand. For much of the 20th century, Fiat was practically another way of saying Italy in industrial form. Imagine the Italian map at the beginning of the 20th century. A newly unified country, still very rural, with huge differences between north and south. In that landscape, a provincial man appears, Giovanni Agnelli, with a very clear intuition. The future is going to move on wheels. In 1899, he takes part in the founding of Fabbrica Italiana Automobili Torino, Italian Automobile Factory Turin. The name already says a lot. Factory, Italian, automobiles, Turin. Everything in one line. At first, these are cars for the few. Almost hand-built models, expensive, closer to luxury toys than mass products. But behind those first vehicles, there is something more ambitious. The idea that Italy too can play in the league of big modern industry, not just sell silk, wine, and scenery. Over the decades, Fiat becomes the mechanical heart of Italian industrialization. It is not just a company, it is an ecosystem. The Mirafiori plant becomes a city within a city. Turin attracts waves of workers arriving from the south, from inland villages, from areas where there has never been an assembly line. Entire neighborhoods are born around factory shifts, the wages of the metal meccanico, the timetable of the buses that shuttle workers back and forth. If in the earlier part of the documentary we spoke of the average European, here we can put a face to the average Italian of the second half of the 20th century. Someone who perhaps grew up in a village in the Mezzogiorno, takes an overnight train to Turin, first lodges in a shared room, and with the first Fiat contract, achieves the dream of a steady wage, some savings, a family. His life revolves around factory whistles, union assemblies, Juventus matches on Sundays. Even if he never sees an Agnelli up close, his existence is directly connected to the decisions taken in their offices. Because while Giovanni lays the industrial foundations, the family saga grows around that gigantic machine. Children, grandchildren, collateral branches, and over time, a figure emerges who will concentrate like no one else, that mix of power, style, and contradiction. Gianni Agnelli, l'avvocato, the lawyer. Gianni is not an industrialist in the classic mold of the cold north. He is the charismatic grandson, the heir-turned symbol. Educated, multilingual, easily recognizable by his impeccable suits, his watch worn over his shirt cuff, his ironic remarks to the press. He is the kind of man who can spend the morning in meetings with politicians, the afternoon in a boardroom, and the evening at a party on the Amalfi Coast, and appear on half the country's front pages the next day. Unlike the Wallenbergs, whose greatest virtue is that almost no one would recognize them in the street, Gianni Agnelli deliberately becomes a public character. He does not just run an industrial empire, he embodies a certain idea of modern Italy. The Italy that makes cars, exports design, rubs shoulders with the great powers, but does not renounce theatricality, gestures, spectacle. In photographs from the time he appears with heads of state, film stars, designers, footballers. The Agnelli family does not simply control factories, it buys and runs newspapers, influences politics, and above all, is associated with one of Italy's great loves, football. Juventus of Turin, under its umbrella, becomes a sporting symbol as powerful as Fiat is in industry. For millions of Italians, the Agnelli surname appears as much in the business pages as in the sports section. But behind that glamour, there is another, less shiny reality. Every car that leaves the assembly line means hard shifts, tough negotiations with unions, labor conflicts. Post-war Fiat does not grow in a vacuum. it does so in a country shaken by constant political crises, fragile governments, the rise of strong labor movements, and later, the violence of the years of lead. In that context, the fiat worker becomes more than an employee. He is a political actor. Strikes in Turin paralyze not only the city, but a large part of the Italian economy. Assemblies at the factory gates become a thermometer of the country's social climate. What is decided at Mirafiori has consequences in Rome and Brussels. And here is where the figure of Gianni Agnelli begins to function, within our documentary, as a thread that returns again and again. Every time Italy's history enters a turbulent zone, he appears with carefully crafted remarks, with visits to the halls of power, with symbolic gestures that the media amplify. He is not an elected politician, he does not run for office, but his opinion carries weight. His industrial decisions affect hundreds of thousands of jobs, and his support, or his distance, can reinforce or weaken governments. If we look at the map of our three dynasties, the differences are clear. The Wallenbergs are textbook technocrats. Their ideal is to make no noise. The Quandts have had to learn to live with a past they prefer to keep in the background, taking shelter in discretion. The Agnellis, by contrast, turn power into a narrative. There are photographers, covers, a myth, that of the elegant patriarch who knows what is best for Italy, of the surname that built the country on four wheels. But as so often, the more visible the surface, the more interesting what happens just below. Fiat and the Agnelli family do not just sail through the economic boom, the sweet years of growth and consumption. They also have to pass through wildcat strikes, factory occupations, bombs from terrorist groups, oil crises that send petrol prices sky high and leave dealerships empty. In those moments, Amalfi Coast glamour mixes with endless meetings in closed offices, with late-night calls to ministers, with restructuring plans that mean plant closures on a map where each factory is, in reality, an entire town. And that is where the power of a modern dynasty is truly put to the test. Not only in the good times of profits and favorable headlines, but in the years when the country seems ungovernable, terrorism hits the streets, and every industrial decision can inflame or calm a social conflict. Because the real exam for the Agnelli saga is not the photo of a new model gleaming at a motor show, but what they do and fail to do when Italy shakes. How they use that unique mix of economic, media, and symbolic influence when the country seems on the verge of falling apart. And that moment arrives. Oil crises, inflation, unemployment, attacks, kidnappings. Factories turn into arenas of ideological and sometimes physical confrontation. It is then that we can see more clearly what it means for one family to have such a large part of a country's economy and imagination in its hands. The next step in our journey inevitably takes us into those turbulent years. Years when the wail of ambulances sounded almost as often as the sirens for shift changes at factories, and when the Agnelli surname was always on the blurred border between order and chaos. Italy entered the 1970s as a country officially at peace, but with a sense of latent civil war. In the streets, bombs, attacks, kidnappings. In factories, wildcat strikes, endless assemblies, clashes between workers, police, students, militants. That explosive mix would be called the Years of Lead, and at the center of one of that period's main volcanoes stood a company, Fiat, and a surname, Agnelli. We return to our earlier worker. Let us give him a name, Mark. He's in his early 30s. He came from the south to Turin with an old suitcase and a contact from a cousin who already worked at the plant. He has spent a decade on the assembly line. He has bought a small flat in the outskirts. He has 2 children. He pays a mortgage. For him, the factory is everything: wage, security, identity, reason for pride, and reason for fear. Because every morning when Mark enters the plant, he does not know whether that day there will be a normal shift, an assembly, picket lines at the gate, or clashes. Radical group slogans appear on the walls. In the cafeteria, pamphlets, union leaflets, strike calls are argued over. Some colleagues are tempted by armed struggle. Others just want their paycheck to last until the end of the month. All feel their lives depend on decisions taken very far from the production line. And at the other end of that invisible cord sits Gianni Agnelli. L'avocado. the brilliant grandson of the founder, the man every politician wants to talk to and every union activist distrusts. For him, Fiat is not just a company that makes cars, it is an instrument to sustain a certain idea of Italy. A modern, Western, capitalist Italy, aligned with the United States and the European community. Every strike, every bomb, every communiqué from the Red Brigades is also read as an attack on that model of country. In those years, Gianni's office becomes a kind of permanent crisis command room. Reports from plants arrive, occupations, sabotage, stoppages. Calls from Rome come in, ministers worried about the economic impact of a potential total shutdown of Fiat. Discreet messages arrive from foreign embassies. Italian stability is a strategic issue in the Cold War. Agnelli does something few business families can do, play simultaneously on 3 boards. On the economic board, he reviews figures, approves or rejects layoffs, modernization plans, closures of less profitable lines. Every column of numbers is, in reality, a map of neighborhoods, families, mortgages like Marx. But in the spreadsheet of the time that cannot be seen, what appears is productivity, labor costs, competitiveness against German or Japanese manufacturers. On the political board, he becomes a privileged interlocutor of governments. He does not need to hold public office. Prime ministers call him, seek his opinion on labor reforms, tax systems, European agreements. He in turn pushes for aid, incentives, protection against foreign competition. When he speaks, he does so not just as the head of a company, but as someone who can put tens of thousands of jobs and the country's social peace in check. On the symbolic board, the Agnellis control something even harder to measure, the imaginary. Through influential newspapers, magazines, television channels, their worldview circulates daily. No explicit orders are needed. It is enough to set editorial lines, promote certain voices, silence others. Fiat appears not only in the business pages, also in adverts, lifestyle features, campaigns that associate the Italian car with modernity, freedom, mobility. And of course, there is football. Juventus, under the Agnelli umbrella, becomes a kind of secular religion for millions of Italians. Every Sunday, while Mark rests from the exhausting week at the factory, he may turn on the radio or television to listen to the match. The same executives who decide his working future are the ones lifting trophies on the pitch. Juventus victories bring pride to Turin, to Piedmont, to part of the country. Defeats, by contrast, feel like a metaphor for something bigger. Crisis, disorder, lack of leadership. Football functions as an emotional escape valve. While wage negotiations are stuck, while headlines talk of kidnappings and attacks, Juventus offers 90 minutes in which everything comes down to a scoreline. But behind that distraction, reality waits. Plant closures, industrial reconversion, robots replacing workers, decisions taken in offices where surnames weigh more than votes. In the midst of this laboratory of crisis, terrorism, and politics, the Agnellis have to keep their balance. If they lay off too many people, they feed anger and radicalization. If they give too much ground, they risk the company's competitiveness and their own position of power. Every concession to unions can be seen by some as weakness. Every cut can be interpreted by others as a provocation. For Mark, all these maneuvers arrive filtered through the factory loudspeaker, the union representative, the evening news. Perhaps he hates the bosses who enrich themselves at the top of the pyramid. Perhaps, in spite of everything, he feels a strange kind of respect for the lawyer who, people say, keeps the country going along with a few others. What he almost never sees is the exact mechanism by which that surname decides over his life. There lies the essence of the modern dynasty. The ability to act on multiple levels at once, to shape laws, narratives, emotions without any need for balcony speeches or crowns glittering in the sun. Power shifts from royal palaces to boards of directors, crisis committees, newspaper editorial rooms, VIP boxes in stadiums. By the end of the years of lead, Italy is still standing, but transformed. Terrorism has been contained, not without a high cost. Fiat is no longer the same giant, omnipotent post-war company. It has had to streamline, cut, automate. The industrial working class that Mark represented begins to shrink. New sectors, new jobs, new insecurities replace the old ones. The Agnellis, however, are still there. perhaps less unquestioned, more exposed to public scrutiny, forced to justify closures and mergers, but still able to pick up the phone and speak directly to ministers, bank presidents, European commissioners, still owners of a football club that fills stadiums and news bulletins, still present in logos that cross motorways and cities. This chapter leaves us with a clear feeling. A modern dynasty does not just survive crises. Sometimes it uses them to redefine itself, to adjust its role in the system without ever leaving the stage. But the world that comes after will be unlike anything Wallenberg, Quandt, or Agnellis knew in the 20th century. Globalization, the fall of the Soviet bloc, the birth of the euro, financial crises, the digital revolution, will force these families to face a new, silent enemy: irrelevance. On this new board, it will no longer be enough to control a big factory, a national bank, or an influential newspaper. They will have to learn to play in global markets against Asian competitors, faceless investment funds, and technological platforms with no clear center. And that is where we will truly see what separates an old, powerful family from a genuine dynasty capable of adapting to any era. History moves forward, and with it, the nature of power changes. If in the 20th century the great industrial families could act almost like states within the state, the 21st century arrives with a brutal warning. The rules of the game are no longer set by surnames, but by the impersonal forces of a global market that does not respect bloodlines. New competitors appear, gigantic investment funds that manage more capital than many countries, tech companies capable of minting millionaires in the space of 5 or 10 years, supranational regulators imposing unprecedented limits. Dynasties that want to survive must not only adapt, they must transform. The first sign of that change comes with the rise of funds like BlackRock, Vanguard, or State Street. They have no face, they have no charismatic founder, they have no national flag. They are colossal structures that buy stakes, impose standards, force mergers, and sometimes dictate strategy to companies that have been in the hands of a family dynasty for more than a century. Next to them, even a powerful surname can seem small. The old European families, used to steering empires from private salons, suddenly find themselves facing organizations where a key decision may come from an algorithm, a technical committee, or an anonymous manager in New York. At the same time, another kind of player emerges: the global tech company. Google, Apple, Amazon, Meta. Firms that in less than 2 decades have accumulated an economic and cultural power that old industrial sagas took a century to build. Their founders show up on rich lists that 20 years ago would have sounded like science fiction. These are first-generation fortunes, fast, based on constant innovation. Against that dizzying pace, the stability of an industrial dynasty can seem at times like a relic. In the midst of this new landscape, what do the Wallenbergs do? The Swedes choose their most characteristic strategy: discretion, professionalization, and international expansion. If in the 20th century they were the silent architects of the Swedish economy, in the 21st, they aimed to become trusted stewards in a much wider world. Investor AB expands into global sectors: medical technology, advanced engineering, automation, future energies. The key is not to compete with the funds in size, that would be impossible, but in reputation, to be seen as stable, patient, long-term partners. Curiously, that almost Nordic style of management becomes an advantage. In a world dominated by rapid financial moves, the promise of continuity is seductive. That is their way of remaining a dynasty, letting time be their ally. The Quandts, by contrast, face a different kind of challenge. BMW, the heart of their power, is caught in an unprecedented storm. The shift to electric cars, Chinese competition, European regulations, the debate over the end of the combustion engine. The family's strategy focuses on reinforcing what they know best: premium cars, turning the brand into a global symbol, not just a German one. While funds and tech firms push forward, the family leans on something that cannot easily be copied: identity. German engineering, craft prestige. The feeling that a BMW is more than a product, it is a cultural statement. On top of that, the Quandts diversify. They invest in batteries, electric mobility, automotive software systems. There is a visible tension between tradition and innovation. If their surname carries a historical shadow, the future must be spotless. To remain relevant, they need not only good products, but a global corporate reputation. It is a fragile balance. If they take too many risks, the legacy might sink. If they are too cautious, BMW could fall behind in the technological revolution that is already here. And then there are the Agnellis. Perhaps no family better embodies the transformation needed to survive in the 21st century. Under the leadership of John Elkann, the heir chosen by his grandfather Gianni, Fiat stops being only a car maker. It becomes Exor, a global holding company investing in automotive, media, technology, health, entertainment, and sport. It is not just about diversifying. It is about leaving behind the traditional industrial model that chained the family to the Italian economy. Elkann understands that the power of the surname cannot depend on a single industry or a single country. Stellantis is born, the result of the merger between Fiat Chrysler and PSA. One of the largest automotive firms in the world, with plants and brands on 4 continents. Fiat stops being just Italy, Jeep stops being just the United States, Peugeot stops being just France. Everything is mixed into a global network where the Agnelli surname appears less on logos, but more often in strategy documents. Exor also invests in media and technology. It buys a stake in The Economist. It enters health and biotech companies. It keeps Juventus as an emotional symbol, even if the club is no longer as central as it was in Gianni's era. The surname is diluted, but it spreads. It is no longer about ruling Turin. It is about sailing a global ocean where the family name helps if you know how to use it, and sinks you if you cling to it too tightly. While all of this unfolds, we return to our average European. But this time, he is no longer Marco on an assembly line. He might be a Spanish engineer working for a Swedish company partly controlled by investor AB. He might be a German driver who buys an electric BMW and takes out an online loan whose back end runs through a bank linked to a Wallenberg foundation. He might be an Italian who reads The Economist without knowing that Exor money is behind it, or a Polish worker employed at a Stellantis plant who has never heard the surname Agnelli. In the age of globalization, power becomes even more invisible, harder to pinpoint, further away from ordinary people, and at the same time, more present in every corner of daily life. Here the central question appears. Does it still make sense to talk about European dynasties when their companies no longer belong to a single country? Their products are made in 10 different places, and their decisions affect people who will never even learn how to pronounce their surnames. The answer, oddly enough, is yes. Because when we look at organizational charts, boards of directors, foundations that hold voting power, the names are still there. Not so big, not so public, but persistent. A structure that survives wars, crises, technological revolutions, and political change. And behind those names, family stories that keep repeating old patterns, tense successions, heirs groomed from childhood, silent conflicts between branches, decisions taken at private dinners where affection and strategy mix just as they did in the courts of old Europe. The crowns disappeared. The dynasties did not. By now, these 3 surnames are no longer just distant labels. They have faces, stories, shadows. But to understand what they mean as modern dynasties, we need to place them side by side. To compare them as 3 different ways of answering the same question. How do you keep family power alive on a continent that claims to have left monarchies behind? Let us start by sketching 3 clear silhouettes. The Wallenbergs represent the model of discrete technocracy. They are not cover stars. They do not produce big sound bites. Their power is presented as something almost natural, almost institutional. If we do not take care of Swedish capitalism, who will? Their brand is not a car or a football club, but a style, sobriety, management, long-term thinking. The Quandts embody something else, immense economic power resting on a history crossed by a morally troubling past. They are proof that a dynasty can survive a war, a criminal regime, and belated public scrutiny, but cannot entirely erase where its wealth comes from. BMW, their great jewel, is at once a symbol of modernity and a reminder that post-war prosperity was built, in part, on human ruins. The Agnellis, for their part, are the model of power wrapped in charisma. Unlike the Wallenbergs, they do not shy away from the spotlight. Unlike the Quandts, they are not mainly associated with guilt, but with glamour, style, football, politics, Italy. They are a dynasty that turned its own life into part of the product, cars, newspapers, and also a family story that felt like an endless film. Seen through the lens of their relationship with the state, the differences become even sharper. In Sweden, the Wallenbergs have blended with the institutions. They do not govern, but they often seem to be part of the machinery that makes the country run. They are present in banks, major firms, strategic projects. When the Swedish state looks to the private sector to carry out industrial policy, a Wallenberg vehicle is rarely far away. There is tension, there is criticism, but also a sort of tacit pact. The family behaves as a responsible manager, and in return, it is allowed to keep a central place. The Quandts in Germany have had a different relationship. Under Nazism, the state was not a partner, but the framework in which their wealth exploded. After the war, the new German state needed to rebuild, create jobs, prove that the country could get back on its feet. In that context, having an industrialist like Herbert Quandt save BMW was useful. There were denazification processes, but also pragmatism. Decades later, when the darker details of the past surfaced, the state was no longer their shield, but the referee having to deal with public pressure. In Italy, the Agnellis have long played a role that runs parallel to politics without merging with it. They are not the state, but fiat has often been treated as a matter of national interest. When plant closures, restructurings, or mergers were on the table, the question was not just economic but political. What did this mean for Italy? Ministers, prime ministers, party leaders, all knew that talking about fiat was talking about a piece of the country. The Agnellis have been interlocutors, allies, sometimes villains, but always leading actors in Italy's political film. Another key axis, how they handle an uncomfortable past. In the Wallenberg case, the past is not so much criminal as ambiguous. During the Second World War, Sweden declared neutrality, and Swedish business, including firms tied to the family, had to move in complicated terrain. The surname carries a contradiction. On one side, the heroic figure of Raoul Wallenberg, protecting thousands of Jews in Budapest. On the other, business operations in a context where nobody came out entirely clean. The family has built its public identity by emphasizing duty, service to the country, and philanthropy, leaning heavily on Raoul's moral symbol, but without forgetting that neutrality never meant complete innocence. The Quandts, by contrast, have had to confront a much harsher past head-on: factories using forced labor, direct benefits from the Nazi apparatus, links with regime figures. For decades, the topic was treated on the margins, almost like background noise. Only when journalists and filmmakers began bringing testimonies and files to light was the family pushed into sponsoring historical studies, acknowledging facts, issuing statements. It is not a closed chapter. It is a wound being managed while trying to keep BMW's successful present from collapsing under the weight of memory. The Agnellis have had a different sort of difficult past, less tied to war crimes, more to controversial decisions. Plant closures, massive redundancies, relocations, risky financial bets, suspicions of excessive closeness to political power. Their story is full of moments when part of the country saw them as saviors and another part as culprits. Scandals, family tragedies, heirs dying young. The past they drag along is not so much legal as emotional, the sense that their power has carried a very high social cost for certain regions and generations of workers. If we look at their public communication, we find three almost opposite strategies. The Wallenbergs choose the shadows. They say only what is necessary, grant few interviews, shelter behind professional structures and foundations. They let reports, results, and balance sheets do the talking. Their power speaks through company names, not grand phrases. The Quandts are discreet as well, but for different reasons. They understood early that the less the BMW brand is associated with the family's history, the better. The spotlight shifts to the product, the engineering, the driving experience. The family exists but remains carefully in the background. The Agnellis, instead, have often played the opposite card, embracing the spotlight when it suited them. Gianni Agnelli was a huge public figure. His suits, his remarks, his love life, his presence at Juventus matches. Turning the family into part of the spectacle was, for decades, an asset. Today, with John Elkann, the tone is more restrained, but the surname is still linked to a story that mixes glamour, tragedy, and power. Behind these communication styles lies something deeper, different ways of managing succession. Wallenberg trains heirs in discipline, and when they do not seem suitable, leans without hesitation on external managers. Quandt distributes stakes, but keeps a family core with clear voting power. Agnellis has gone through dramatic succession crises, unexpected deaths, internal feuds, Gianni's decisions that altered the hereditary line and placed John Elkann at the top. And as we analyze all of this, we return to the silent character who has accompanied the documentary, the average European. He does not know the details of the discussions in boardrooms. He has not read reports on the Quandts' Nazi past or academic studies on the social construction of the Swedish model around the Wallenbergs. He has not followed every step of Exor's mergers or Stellantis' structure. What he has experienced are the consequences. The mass redundancy plan at a car plant. The mortgage with conditions decided in distant offices. The medicine that does, or does not, arrive at his local pharmacy. The temporary job at a company that belongs in part to one of these groups. For him or for her, surnames are irrelevant. What matters is whether they can make it to the end of the month. And yet, when we piece everything together, the picture is unsettling. 3 families whose ancestors were making decisions in times of war, crisis, and reconstruction are still shaping Europe's economic structure a century later. They do not govern countries, they do not sign treaties, but they influence who has a job, which sectors get investment, and which companies survive a crisis. Here comes the new hook that leads us into the final stretch of the documentary. If just 3 surnames can shape so many lives without most people even knowing their stories, how many other modern dynasties are operating right now in the background? Funds created by families that never appear in the press. Surnames that control construction firms, pharmaceutical companies, energy groups, tech businesses. Names that one day will appear in a footnote of a history book, and that today are quietly deciding tomorrow's economic landscape. To get a sense of where all this is headed, we have to look a little further ahead, to the sons and daughters of these families, to the new technological and financial elites, and to a continent that proclaims meritocracy while still accumulating surnames that weigh more than others. The future of European dynasties is not just in history books, but in the decisions being taken right now while you watch this video. Up to now, we have talked about companies, holdings, foundations, stakes, mergers. But any dynasty, aristocratic or financial, always has the same Achilles heel: succession. Who comes next? Who inherits not just the shares, but the responsibility and the weight of the name? In the age of kings, that problem had an almost automatic answer: the firstborn, the male heir, the person designated by law. Today, in economic dynasties, the situation seems more flexible, but the conflict is still the same. What happens when the charismatic founder is gone, and those who remain look nothing like him? In the Wallenberg family, the challenge has never been so much money as the continuity of style. For more than a century, the surname has been tied to a very specific idea: discipline, discretion, service to the country, sober management. The new Wallenbergs grow up in a world completely different from that of their great-grandparents. They speak English from childhood, study at global universities, work in investment banks, consultancies, tech startups. And yet, from day one, they know that something more than a career rests on their shoulders. Being good at finance is not enough. They have to live up to a figure like Raoul, to the myth of the prudent banker, to the narrative of guardians of the Swedish model. And that often means giving up their own careers, an anonymous life, the chance to make mistakes without seeing them in the papers. At family gatherings, the surname can sound almost like a command. A Wallenberg does not do that. A Wallenberg does not behave like that. The dynasty is sustained not only through boards of directors, but through an internal culture passed on at dinners, shared summers, disapproving looks when someone breaks the unspoken code. For the Quandts, the burden is different, almost heavier. It is not just expectation, it is historical memory. Today's heirs are born decades after the Second World War. They did not sign contracts with the Nazi regime. They did not manage factories using forced labor. But their wealth, their shareholdings, their lifestyle are inevitably connected to decisions taken back then. Imagine, just for a moment, a young family member sitting in an interview at a foreign university or chatting with friends when someone asks about the surname, "So are you one of those Quandts, those Quandts?" And all at once, the history books, documentaries, black and white photos walk into the room uninvited. For the heirs, the dilemma is uncomfortable. How do you inherit a firm, a fortune, and a board seat, without also inheriting a guilt that is not yours but is not entirely someone else's either? Some get involved in memory projects, foundations, symbolic efforts at reparation. Others choose invisibility. The less the past is mentioned, the better. But the surname, however silent, does not vanish. It remains printed on share certificates, family protocols, photos in living rooms where previous generations pose in suits with unreadable expressions. And then there are the Agnellis, whose succession has been almost a public saga. Gianni Agnelli, l'Avvocato, raised the surname to the level of national myth. He was not just Fiat's boss, he was a kind of secular prince of Italy, elegant, ambiguous, always halfway between factory and yacht, business and nightlife. To inherit that was, quite simply, impossible. Family tragedies made everything even more complicated. Natural heirs dying young or drifting away, branches of the family in conflict, changes of will, decisions that finally put John Elkann, Gianni's grandson through his daughter, at the head of the conglomerate. Elkann embodies a new kind of heir, educated at international schools and universities, speaking a cooler, more corporate language, far less theatrical than his grandfather's. He has to be modern, serious, global, while carrying a surname that evokes a different Italy, a different era, a different capitalism. For many Italians, the contrast is brutal. L'Avvocato was overflowing charisma. John is calculation, restraint, multinational strategy. Behind that transition lies something we rarely see. Hours of family meetings, tension, silences, cousins who feel their place has been stolen, others who run from the spotlight because they cannot bear the pressure. Not everyone wants to be there. Not everyone can stand the expectations. In any modern dynasty, there are always three kinds of members. Those who embrace the surname and the role, gladly or resignedly, accepting that their life will be marked by that responsibility. Those who try to negotiate, to remain part of the system, but on their own terms, at their own pace, with their own project. And those who quietly move away, they start their own businesses, choose artistic careers, move to other countries, try to be someone other than the son of, the granddaughter of. Sometimes, these last ones are the ones who pay the highest price. The guilt of having betrayed the legacy, the feeling of not being good enough, the inner conflict between being true to themselves and loyal to the family. And here it is worth pausing and turning the camera towards you, the viewers. We love imagining the lives of these families as a blend of luxury, cars, mansions, and yachts. But if we scratch the surface, the picture is more ambiguous. A childhood under constant scrutiny. Teachers, coaches, friends who look at them differently because they know the surname. Every romantic relationship potentially read as strategic. Every mistake amplified, every failure turned into a headline. Let us ask ourselves honestly, if tomorrow you were offered to be born as a Wallenberg, a Quandt, or an Agnelli, with everything that implies money, but also weight, history, expectations, would you say yes without hesitation? Or would you start to see that life is a golden cage no one asks if you want to leave? Because deep down, that is what a dynasty is, a system in which the surname decides many things for you before you are old enough to decide anything. There are immense privileges, yes, but also very little freedom to make small mistakes, to disappear, to be simply anonymous. And while all these storms unfold in private drawing rooms, in discreet meetings, in therapy sessions, in family arguments we will never see, the rest of us keep watching. The surface. From the outside, we see logos on cars and bank branches, badges on football shirts, foundation names on the facade of a museum, business articles on mergers, layoffs, record profits. We know there is a family behind it, but we do not think of them as people with fear, doubts, exhaustion. In our minds, they are a kind of monolithic block, the Wallenbergs, the Quandts, the Agnellis. And yet, if succession stories show us anything, it is that no surname is eternal. Some are managed well and consolidated. Others fall into internal wars, split apart, dilute their power, sell companies, and turn into legend or footnote. From inside, the question that probably haunts them most is simple and brutal. Will we be the generation that ruins it? For an heir, that can be far more terrifying than losing an ordinary job. It is not just about money. It is about feeling you have destroyed a 100-year legacy, that you have failed to meet a family myth that has been with you since the cradle. At the end of this part of the journey, we are left with a double image. On one side, the surname as a financial asset, as a key to boardrooms, as a mark of trust or suspicion in the market. On the other, the surname as psychological burden, as inherited responsibility, as a story with chapters written before you were born. Modern dynasties do not live only in balance sheets and stock markets. They live inside their heirs' heads. Meanwhile, from the outside, we keep seeing buildings, factories, logos, without realizing that many of these power structures are literally carved into stone. If we close the history books and simply walk out into the street, their power stops being theory and becomes something very concrete: stone, steel, glass, and grass. Picture our average European one last time. He leaves home on an ordinary Monday. He's not thinking about Wallenberg, Quandt, or Agnellis. He's thinking about getting to work, paying the mortgage, not missing the bus. To reach the office, he crosses a bridge built decades ago thanks to an engineering firm that, at some point, belonged to the Wallenberg orbit. He walks past a glass and steel building, the headquarters of a tech multinational that began life as an industrial project funded by Swedish banking under family foundation management. He does not know it, but part of the money that raised that building came from decisions taken in sober rooms where people talk more about long-term return than about flags. Later, he opens his laptop in a research center, a hospital, or a university. The name of the building refers to an institute, a foundation, a center of excellence. If he looked at the small plaque at the entrance, he might read a surname known only to specialists, a chair funded by a family trust, a library paid for by a donation made in memory of. It is the modern equivalent of the old patron commissioning paintings from a Renaissance artist. Only now the canvas is a database, a laboratory, a supercomputer. In Germany, our average European might leave work, get into his car, and drive along a motorway designed for vehicles that, for decades, have symbolized the country's economic miracle. The logo on the steering wheel is familiar. The surname of the main shareholder family is not. When he fills the tank, when he goes in for servicing, when he pays a lease, he is feeding a value chain that ultimately flows, in part, into a handful of historic shareholders. If that same European is a football fan, chances are that at the weekend he will sit in front of the television or go to a stadium that belongs to the Agnellis symbolic universe. The stands, shirts, advertising boards, VIP boxes are a modern theater where the identity of a club long tied to a surname is celebrated. In the past, noble families commissioned operas and funded theaters. Today, some build training centers and support teams that stir emotions far stronger than any political speech. Away from the spectacle, similar scenes repeat in other forms. Cultural centers in refurbished old factories, museums housed in former industrial headquarters, business parks built on land that 40 years ago formed part of a factory complex. What used to be castles on hilltops are now office towers in financial districts. What used to be ballrooms are now boardrooms with endless tables and huge screens. Patronage of painters and composers has turned into funding for startups, university scholarships, innovation programs. The storytelling has changed shape too. The old dynasties told their story with coats of arms, genealogies, and oil portraits. The new ones do it with brand campaigns, motivational slogans, and corporate videos. Where once people spoke proudly of lineage, now they repeat the word team. Where once they displayed blood, now they display corporate values, sustainability, innovation, social responsibility. In many cases, the public story of these companies softens or erases their family origin. The brand presents itself as an almost abstract entity. We are all of us. We are our employees. We are our customers. The surname is pushed into a discrete second row, hidden in the ownership structure, in the name of a foundation, in a scholarship program. And yet, if you follow the trail of plaques, annual reports, and board lists, the pattern returns. Families that for decades, sometimes more than a century, have decided what to fund, what to sell, what to rescue, and what to let fall. Our average European walks through his city and sees a bank headquarters dominating the main square, a conference center named after a foundation, A research institute carrying the surname of someone who will never appear in sports news, but who has put millions into that building. An industrial plant on the outskirts, with a global logo that is the result of mergers and acquisitions pushed by family holdings. All of that is the contemporary equivalent of walking 200 years ago through a European capital and seeing palaces, noble residences, coats of arms carved in stone, equestrian statues. Europe's physical landscape has always been, in part, a map of its elites. The difference now is that the link is less obvious. We do not see crowns on facades, but logotypes. We do not see heraldry, but brands. And that makes us forget something essential. Behind every building named after a foundation, behind every business campus and every stadium, there are family stories that do not fit into a press release. On that everyday walk, our protagonist is not thinking about succession meetings, tense conversations among siblings, silent agreements with governments. He only sees jobs, leisure, consumption, services. And in part, that is exactly what these dynasties have sought, for their presence to be felt without becoming too visible. Every so often, a crack reveals the inside. A scandal, an investigation, a documentary, a succession conflict that leaks to the press. For a moment, the public discovers that behind the shiny facade, there are internal struggles, morally questionable choices, uncomfortable pasts. But as quickly as they appear, these episodes usually fade. Reports are published, statements are made, boards are reshuffled, company names are changed, life goes on. The flow of cars, bank transactions, football matches, funded projects does not stop. And even so, after everything we have covered in this documentary, one feeling remains. We do not know the whole story. There are chapters locked away under confidentiality clauses, corporate archives that will take decades to open, if they ever open. Decisions taken in meetings with no public minutes, only fragmentary memories of those present. Heirs who will never give interviews, who will never tell their side, who prefer anonymity in exchange for keeping control. Our average European will continue crossing squares, entering offices, celebrating goals, using products and services without thinking about any of this. And that may be understandable. No one can live with all these invisible threads constantly present in their daily life. But once you have seen the map, it is hard to unsee it. Europe's landscape, its factories, stadiums, campuses, research centers, is not neutral. It is the accumulated result of decisions taken by a few families who for decades have been in the right place to say yes or no. And that is the question that accompanies us towards the end. If the old dynasties raised castles and cathedrals to make it obvious who was in charge, what are today's corporate headquarters, privately funded museums, and surname-linked stadiums telling us? Everything you have heard is documented: names, percentages, companies, historical facts. There is no need to imagine a government in the shadows to accept a basic reality. In Europe, a significant share of economic power is concentrated in few family hands, just as it once was in few crowns. And yet, unlike those crowns, these modern dynasties do not need your admiration. They do not expect you to hang their portrait in your living room or memorize their family tree. They are content with something much more discreet, that you keep using their products, working in their companies, depositing your money in their banks, celebrating the goals of their teams without asking too many questions. Today, as you watch this video, the Wallenbergs are still sitting, literally or metaphorically, close to the heart of the Swedish economy. The foundations that bear their name continue to hold stakes in banks, industries, tech firms. The Quandts are still major shareholders of BMW, a brand that has become almost synonymous with the modern German car. The Agnellis, through Exor and other structures, maintain interests spread around the world: automotive, media, football, industry, technology, and they are not alone. There are other family dynasties, less known outside their countries, operating in similar ways: in France, in Spain, in the Netherlands, in the United Kingdom. Some show up discreetly on rich lists, others hide behind neutral-sounding holdings. Alongside them, there are structures that imitate their logic without having a surname: large investment funds, sovereign vehicles, financial groups that do not pass from generation to generation within one family, but do pass within a very specific elite. It is very likely that today, in Europe, There are people with surnames you have never heard of, with no presence on social media, no television interviews, who control more wealth and more decision-making capacity than many ministers or members of parliament. Not because they have seized anything in the dark, but because they have inherited positions, managed to keep them, and the system allows them to keep expanding that power year after year. The question is not whether this exists. The question is what we do with that reality. Are you reassured by the idea that there are families with decades, even more than a century of experience running companies, handling crises, taking long-term decisions? Some see this as a form of stability, surnames that think in generations, not electoral cycles, fortunes that cannot afford to destroy what feeds them. Or does it unsettle you that no one has ever voted for these people, that their power does not pass through a parliament but through a boardroom, that their legitimacy does not come from a ballot box but from inheritance, family pacts, and notarial documents? If you knew that your job ultimately depends on the return threshold, a small group of heirs considers acceptable. If you knew that your pension is invested, directly or through funds, in companies controlled by 3 or 4 surnames. If you knew that the team your children play for, the newspaper you read, the hospital where you are treated, all belong to ownership chains that end in a few very specific families. Would that feel normal? Or would you sense something is off in this idea of democracy where we vote for governments, but not for those who control a huge part of the economy that sustains those governments? There is no single right answer. Some will say, it has always been this way. Before it was nobles, now it is business people. Better a stable family capitalism than a system where everything is in the hands of faceless funds, with no ties, no commitment to any country. Others will answer, precisely because it has always been like this, we should ask whether we want to keep accepting it without looking too closely under the carpet. Perhaps the problem is not the existence of dynasties, but the silence around them. The fact that, to know their stories, we have to dive into economics books, corporate reports, biographies, and, now and then, uncomfortable documentaries. The fact that most Europeans can recite their team's lineup by heart, but have no idea who decides each year whether that club takes on more debt, gets sold, or becomes just another brand in a global group. Perhaps deep down, we have not moved beyond the age of dynasties. We have simply changed their wardrobe. Where there used to be military uniforms and crowns, now there are business suits and discreet watches. Where there used to be coats of arms, now there are logos. Where there used to be hilltop palaces, now there are corporate headquarters in office districts. But the underlying question is the same as 200, 500, or 1,000 years ago. Who decides our future? Do we accept it because we believe there is no better alternative? Do we tolerate it because we prefer not to look too closely? Or do we at least begin by learning these names, understanding their stories, seeing how they fit into the continent's political and economic map? Europe no longer bows before emperors on balconies, nor listens to proclamations from golden thrones. Today, power is exercised in shareholder meetings, investment committees, and boards of directors. The surnames have changed, the crowns have been put away, but the question is exactly the same as ever. Who decides our future, and how much do we really want to know about them?